Greetings, heroes! It is I, your friendly neighborhood Rabbi John Carrier, and I am here for another live studio recording session of the Jew Curious Show. This is a podcast available on iTunes, on Stitcher Radio, on Google Play, and all your favorite podcast locations. And I am excited to do this in kind of a live Q&A format. So we're going to talk about Jewish prayer today. So the big question that you might have if you've encountered Jewish prayer at all, if you've been to a synagogue service more than once and you're like, why are they saying the exact same things as they did last time I was here? And if you open up the prayer book, it looks like kind of a script where all the prayers are given there for you to read. Is it possible to color outside the lines, right? Do I have to pray exactly what's on the page? Is it possible to bring my own prayers of the heart? Can I pray any place, not just in a synagogue? Can I pray the words that I have to say? Can I pray any time I want, not just during the fixed prayer service times? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. The short answer is yes. There's a lot of room in Jewish prayer practice to pray the prayers of your own heart whenever the mood takes you, wherever you happen to be. And we'll probably come back to this theme again that Rebbi Nachman of Breslov, sort of the progenitor of the Breslover Hasidic movement, said you should talk to God like you're talking to a friend. And we'll talk about how to do that in this video and in this podcast as well. Really happy to see CJ here from Delaware and Carla from West Hollywood and Kathy's coming in from SoCal. So we'll get into it in just a second. But first, I want to do a little bit of a podcast announcery thing. I'll say, how's the sound, everybody? Yesterday, we had a little bit of trouble with our sound. This has been a week plagued by technical difficulties on the Jew Curious show and in our school as well. So if you can hear me, say loud and clear or something like that. So we got William coming in from Akiva Springs, Florida. Welcome. Just going to do this is a, let's see. Okay. Sounds great in Georgia, says Bud Rod. So we're gonna take a Georgian's word for it, which is always a good policy, I think. So we'll get started in just a moment. If this is your first time joining us, this may seem like a little bit different YouTube video than you get from your typical rabbi, which I am probably not. I think most people would agree to that. But so what we do here is this is going to be a live studio recording for a podcast episode that's going to, in the future, I was going to say appear, but appear is something with your eyes. A podcast is something with your ears. Will be on the roster for the Jew Curious Show, which is a podcast for Jew Curious people. If you are Jewish, if you are not Jewish, but, kind of thinking about it, or at least curious about it, if you're a person of a different faith, just looking into the Hebrew roots of your own tradition, if you're just a spiritual seeker looking for the right path for you, you have come to the right place. And every weekday, usually in the morning, we talk about some aspect of Jewish tradition or Jewish wisdom, because I think these traditions and this wisdom really help people to develop lives of greater meaning, greater joy, greater human connection, and greater personal growth. And that is the mission of the Jew Curious Show, to provide these kinds of benefits for anybody who is remotely Jew curious. So how this goes is I'm going to record a bit of a podcast intro. Sounds like a radio announcer voice, which I've cultivated over a lifetime of, getting up and making a monkey in front of myself in front of people. And then we'll jump right into the show, give some shout outs to the people who are showing up live. So I really appreciate there's usually more people watching than there are people talking in the chat. So if you're lurking, that's fine. You lurk your lurk, lurk in your lurkum, as it says in, what is that guy? The Lorax talks about somebody lurking in a lurkum. That's fine, but I will ask you to have courage and ask what questions you have, because if you have a question, chances are other listeners to the show have the same question. And if you ask the question and I give you an answer, not only do you benefit, but anybody else who has that question will get an answer as well. So I encourage people to have courage in asking questions. And don't worry, it's a nice bunch. The chat people, I'm no longer surprised at the hospitality of the community in our chat, but I am always impressed. So we've got some loud and clears. I think it's going all right. I apologize. I have a bit of a cold today because I have children who are in school, and so I'm periodically sick. So just going to clear the pipes a little bit. Red leather, yellow leather, unique New York, unique New York. Kathy's talking about tax season. Yes, that season is upon us. But the nice thing is, right after tax season is over, we get to relax for Passover, which is a totally stress-free holiday of non-spring cleaning. Just kidding. So let's go ahead and get into it. Hero. What's the big question that heroes might have? Let's see. Hero, if you have ever opened up a Jewish prayer book, a Siddur, and if you haven't, I highly recommend it personally. But if you've opened it up, you've probably noticed that we have this script for prayer that we use over and over again all the time. We pray the same prayers every day with, some variation on Shabbat and holidays, and we pray at fixed times during the day and during the week. And you may wonder, is there any room in Jewish prayer for, let's say, improvisation? Can you pray the prayers of your heart? Can you pray wherever you are at whatever time your spirit moves you? We're going to talk about that today, both the value of we're going to talk about the value of fixed prayer and the room that Judaism makes and the reverence it holds for spontaneous personal prayer as well, right after this bass. And now that the air conditioner's on, it's a good time to take a print of silence. This is what I do to help sweeten the sound before it goes into podcast form. So we're going to count to 10 here quietly. Thank you, Ron Snow, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Joey Weissenberg and the Hadar Ensemble for those inspiring opening beats. I want to give a special thanks to my live studio audience today here on YouTube. Your questions make this podcast what it is. Your kindness in the community of people in the chat encourages people to come back and ask even more questions. Most of all, thank you, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious Show podcast today. In today's episode, we are going to talk about Jewish prayer and two, let's say, modes of Jewish prayer. One we'll call keva, which describes the fixed nature of Jewish prayer. We pray the same prayers every day on a regular schedule, ideally in a place with other people, and which gives us kind of a prayer routine. But there is also something called kavanah, which means intention or intentionality, which also describes a mode of Jewish prayer that is purely individual and spontaneous. And we'll discuss how the tension and dynamism between fixed and spontaneous prayer defines the Jewish prayer service, but also makes room for everyone to say whatever you have to say to God. We'll get into that in just a minute. First, I'll say if this is your first time here or one of your first times here, I highly recommend that you subscribe to the Jew Curious Show on your favorite podcast listening device. There's usually a button or a picture of a button that you could tap. And if you do, without working too hard beyond that, you will automatically download every single episode that comes out and have complete access to the 30-plus episodes that we've recorded so far. One thing I'm really excited about, some news I want to share, we have just crossed 10,000 total downloads for the Jew Curious Show. That means one of our about 35 episodes so far have been downloaded a total of 10,000 times. The math works out to about, let's say, about 285 downloads per episode, which is about the crowd I used to see for high holidays back when I was a rabbi in a regular pulpit gig, let's say. So that's a high holidays room full of people listening to 35 hours worth of Jewish learning and Jewish conversations, and that blows me right away. And I couldn't have done it without all the great listeners that we have to this show, people spreading the word, people giving us great reviews on iTunes. And that's a significant milestone for me personally, but also I think a significant milestone for the community of Jew-curious people. So I wanted to share that news with you. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the generous folk who have joined our live studio audience. We have made Minyan. We are past 10 people watching right now, and some people sharing themselves in the chat. Oh, yeah. I see my buddy Eric. I see my buddy Count Connor. Already message retracted. He said, seems like he said something rude already. That's okay. Let's see. Let's see who else is in the live stream today. 1 second. Bright and early, we have Kathy from Southern California, Carla from West Hollywood. CJ is coming in from Delaware. Delaware, CJ, I would like to introduce you to my friend Count Connor in the chat. He is, when I think of Delaware, I think of Count Connor. And so that's why I was so excited to meet you, because I know Delawareans, Delaweavers, I don't know what you say, Delawareites are always nice people. That's why George Washington crossed that river. I see Edith coming in from New York. We are coast to coast, y'all. William is from Akiva Springs, Florida. It is sunny there today. Bud Ron coming in from Georgia to give me a sound check. Sounds good. We had a little static in the microphone yesterday. Let's see who else is here. Vanessa is coming in from Germany. Always glad to have you here, Vanessa. You ask great questions, and I'm sure today will be no exception. So let's get on with. Sorry, this is a boy. I don't know if it's the allergies or if it's the cold. Either way, maybe they'll battle each other and resolve this thing soon. Okay, let's do this. When I first encountered Jewish prayer, it was a bit opaque to me. I'll say it that way. I came into the conservative movement of Judaism as an adult, which means that the prayer services, mostly we went on Shabbat, which is the longest service of the week. So the prayer services were 2 to 3 hours long, and I didn't know this at the time because I didn't understand Hebrew, but they were saying pretty much the same thing every single time. And when I became familiar with the prayer book and saw people turning the pages, I noticed that the prayers that were being read from one Shabbat to the next, the very same prayers. There was some variation in the reading. Sometimes if it was coincided with a holiday or something, there'd be some variation. But for the most part, it was striking to me to notice that Jewish prayer came in a fixed format, that everybody was reading the exact same prayer. And I was accustomed to this from, my upbringing was sort of, I'll say, mixed Protestant, where some of the prayers were said every single week, but for the most part, it was a little bit improvisational. Different songs would be sung. Of course, the sermon would be different every week. The reading would be different every week. But for the most part, it was sort of as the Spirit moved people to pray what they had to pray. That's what I was familiar with. And now I'm learning a new tradition of saying the same prayers every single time. And a word for this that we have in Jewish thought is keva, which means fixed or fixity. And for some people, that's very helpful, right? I'm going to be praying the same prayers that I prayed last week. I don't have to think too hard about how this is changing. It engenders a kind of meditative mindset where you repeat this litany, the same litany every single time. And it allows you to sort of let go of your conscious planning of what you're going to say next. But for some people, this is stifling. It feels rote. It feels tired after a while. And people ask the question, can't I pray whatever it is I have to say to God, or whatever it is I have to meditate on today? If you're not a God person, there's room for you in Judaism as well. And the answer is absolutely yes. There is, to counterbalance keva, this thing we called kavanah. And kavanah generally means intention or intentionality, or the focus or direction that you're pointing your heart or your consciousness in the moment. And so you can imagine that many people are drawn to this. Can you pray spontaneously? Can you say what you have to say to God? Absolutely. Some people synthesize the two, and while they're reading through the rote prayers that we say every single time, they may focus on a different idea within those words, or they may bring a different intention to it based on their mood or based on where they're at in their life. And you can have fixed prayer with a kind of variable intentionality, let's say. The benefit of this is this allows each of us to express ourselves in prayer individually, right? We may not, for example, there's a prayer in the weekday Amidah that we say every single weekday, like 3 times if you're going to all the traditional services. And you pray for crops. I'm not going to lie to you. It says, God, send us rain so we could have crops. This year's crops can be like the best year's crops. I'm going to tell you, I have never had crops. I am not a farmer. I did successfully grow peppers on my balcony once in Los Angeles, but being Los Angeles, the squirrels stole all my peppers. And I'm going to say, if I ever meet a squirrel that can take down a bush full of habaneros, I'm walking the other way. That's just terrifying. So there is a fire-breathing squirrel out there somewhere. That's my only association with crops. So what does this prayer mean to me? Well, I don't intend to grow anything, but I do work for a living, right? I do put things out in the world, hope some money comes back, put some time into helping people out. And if my intention isn't about planting or farming, I can focus my attention on my own prosperity. Say we're asking God to bless we're asking God to bless the work of our hands, whatever that work may be. So within that fixity of keva, I can add the kavanah of I teach Torah on YouTube for a living. I lead prayers and things like that. So I don't farm, but I do sow and I do reap in after a fashion. This can work if you're an accountant. Kathy, it keeps bringing up tax season, which makes me think Kathy might be a CPA. I'm not certain about that. This is the harvest time for CPAs working on individual tax returns, and God willing, all the CPAs out there have a bumper crop of tax return based income. So that's my intentionality today. May all the CPAs working on taxes, including mine, have a good year. And so the question is, why don't we just pray spontaneously? So a question you can ask is, why don't we just pray spontaneously all the time, right? Why don't we just show up and share the prayers that we have? Why do we need this structure, this system that some people can find stifling? And once again, the answer is you absolutely can. There are moments in the service, for example, the Amidah. And Amidah can be one of the most fixed prayers that we have. It's the one prayer service that we have every single service, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, or on Shabbat, or on holidays, sometimes an extra time on holidays, 2 extra times on, 2 extra times on Yom Kippur. And every time we say it privately or silently. There's a script for us, but you don't have to follow the script. Right? You can insert, and I always instruct when I'm leading a congregation in this prayer, I always say, whatever you have to say to God right now, whatever thoughts you want to meditate on, this is the place to do it. Because the Amidah, when it was invented, was a silent, private meditation with no script. It was just quiet time within a structured service where people could pray spontaneously. But over the years, they discovered there are some people who come to prayer services because they want to pray, but they don't know what to say. They don't have the words in that moment. And so the rabbis began to say, okay, well, if you don't know what to say this, right? Here's a nice thing to pray for: prosperity, forgiveness, healing for your loved ones, healing for yourself, right? Here are some things to choose from. And eventually, once we added these things as a script, people began to follow the script more and more. And then we had a little thing at the end where it says, okay, whatever personal prayers you want to say, those are up to you. But in contemporary prayer books, that part where it says at the end of the Amidah, you can add personal prayers at this time, then it gives you a personal prayer to say. This is a kind of, I think maybe we've lived through eras where we lost the ability to just pray in our own words. And so we have this structure to lean on when we need it. And we've come to depend on that. And so someone might ask, does this mean that my own prayer isn't valuable, that I'm given all these prayers to say? Does this mean that the rabbis who invented these prayers didn't believe in the power of personal prayer? And I want to give some evidence that I discovered a couple of years ago, quite to the contrary. It wasn't that the rabbis who organized our prayer service didn't believe in the power of personal prayer. They believed in it so much that they thought it could be dangerous, in a sense, that personal prayer is so powerful that if we come to a prayer space full of emotion, full of need, maybe full of desperation, maybe full of, let's say, anger, and we prayed for the wrong things, those things may come true to the detriment of people in our community and to ourselves. There's a story in the Talmud where these two rabbis are having a beef, and it's a pretty serious beef. Like, one rabbi had just deposed the other one as the head of the academy, and he was ticked, right? Now, this was kind of a small town. The deposed rabbi's wife was the sister of the guy who deposed him. And she knew that personal prayer could be so powerful that she basically kept her husband from praying, because she knew that the state of mind that her husband was in, if he prayed his own prayers, it could be the end of her brother. And so she would always interrupt him all the time. Every time she saw him starting to pray, she's like, hey, I'm going to go out to the store. You need anything? Did you fix this problem? Did you fix that problem? She would always interrupt him when he was about to pray, because she knew that personal prayer was so powerful, and he was in a kind of mood where it could be destructive. And of course, this woman was a charitable woman. So there was one time where it said a beggar came to the door, knocked on the door looking for something to eat. And she interrupted her interrupting of her husband, went to the door to give the beggar some food. And when she came back, she saw her husband in prayer. And immediately she was downtrodden, because she knew what was about to happen. Next thing you know, she gets a message that her brother had died. And so it wasn't that the rabbis didn't believe that personal prayer was effective or powerful or necessary. They believed in it so much that they said, let's have a fixed way to pray so that we don't, in the heat of passion, pray for the wrong things. And we'll limit the places in the traditional prayer service where personal prayers can come out. Nevertheless, that seems to have almost worked too well, to the point that people don't have the vocabulary for prayer anymore. Especially people who have grown up in a system of praying that seems fixed and rigid. And so I'm here to encourage you. Now, don't be going to zapping people with your prayers. That's terrible. Like, don't be that rabbi, praying for zapping the other rabbi. But whatever you have to say to God is okay, whether that's friendly things, whether that's sad things, whether that's angry things. When I started believing in God again, it's because I believed in a God who could, and people might get upset by this, I believed in a God who could take a punch, basically. I believed in a God who could listen to me rant and rave and have the patience and forbearance to forgive me, letting me talk to that God as a friend. And sometimes when we talk to friends, we rant and rave, right? But our friends will stick by us, knowing that that anger will settle, knowing that that sadness will abate, and that we'll still be in relationship, that we'll still be in covenant. So another question that might arise is, if we can pray whatever we want to pray, And let's say we are skillful prayers, which is different from prayers, same spelling. Why don't we just pray what we want to pray all the time? And this goes back to the notion that sometimes we feel like it, sometimes we feel like praying, sometimes we don't. But if we go long enough about it, it gets rusty. But if we go long enough without it, we may get rusty. If we didn't have the fixed prayers to learn from, to learn the vocabulary and the approach to prayer, we may say our prayers inappropriately or in ways that don't move us, right? And so I want to share with you a lesson of one of my greatest teachers, and I'll say one of anybody's greatest teachers who's living today, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who is the rector of American Jewish University and a teacher at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, where I studied. And he teaches the theology and philosophy of prayer. In addition to his many fine qualities as a teacher, as a posek, a decisor of Jewish law, as a scholar of Jewish tradition, he is also a baseball fan. So how he teaches keva, this value of fixed prayer, is as an at-bat, right? The reason we have 3 times a day to pray and that we have these prayers in kind of a fixed order every single time, he says, think of these as at-bats. Sometimes when you come to pray and you really pour your heart out and you feel the spiritual connection with God, with the other people in the room, it feels like a home run, right? But how often are you going to hit home runs if you don't take your at-bats, right? And so this keva of prayer is to give us the maximum number of at-bats. We go in the morning, we go in the afternoon, we go in the evening. Some of us only go on Shabbos, and that's fine. The point is showing up in a regular way and taking your at-bat. And sometimes it's going to be a home run. Sometimes it's going to be like an inside-the-park double. Sometimes it's going to be a strikeout. Sometimes it's going to be a bunt. Sometimes you're going to get walked, maybe. I don't know. Maybe I'm hyperextending this metaphor. But the point is, if you don't take your at-bats, it's harder and harder to learn how to hit a home run, right? The more you put yourself in prayer, the deeper you can go in prayer, the more you have the vocabulary, the more you have the openness to that spiritual connection. And I often ask my class that I'm teaching, I often ask one of my classes when I'm teaching about prayer, do you know who is the baseball player with the record number of strikeouts in all of baseball history? That may have changed since then. It's been a while. But Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth has or had held for a long time the record number of strikeouts in baseball. But he also, for a long time, held the record number of home runs. Why? Because he put himself in the place to have the most at-bats. And today he is a baseball legend. I don't know what his prayer life was like. I imagine he prayed from time to time. And so if you are wary of this fixed service at fixed times, where you may go and sometimes it feels good, sometimes it doesn't, am I wasting my time? I want you to think of it as an at-bat, as an opportunity to try on a new prayer, to focus on different things in the service than maybe you focused on before, and to open yourself up to the possibility of a home run. And the last thing that I want to share with you before we jump into the Q&A, because I do want to answer whatever questions people have about Jewish prayer today, I have a slightly different metaphor from baseball. I don't know much about baseball. I like going to the pro games. I like, the spirit of the game. I like singing in the 7th inning stretch. But for me, baseball is a fun thing to do with my kids, but the sport itself is, what do they say? It's like 12 people standing around waiting for somebody to make a mistake or something like that. What I do really love and know a little bit more about is music. And so for me, the difference between keva and kavanah, this fixed and the spontaneous, is like the difference between doing your scales and playing jazz, right? If anybody's practiced music here before, you got to do your scales, right? To understand the relationships between the different notes, to warm up your fingers, to just get good at playing music, you have to do the occasionally boring work of doing your scales. And on the other hand, we have jazz, which is this beautiful improvisational art form, can soar in all sorts of different directions you may not expect. And it's quintessentially, again, improvisational and spontaneous. And when it is at its best, it's because it goes to places you didn't expect. You could not have anticipated when you started listening to it, or even when you started playing it, if you're a jazz musician. However, any jazz musician will tell you, if you want to get good at jazz, you got to do your scales, right? That practice, that fixity, that understanding how things are organized is what allows you to bend and break the rules from time to time for great effect. And so that's how I've always seen this keva and kavanah. You show up in the keva moments to do your scales, but that is what lets you play jazz. If you've got something really important to pray for or pray about, don't let that be the first time you pray. If you got to say it, say it. My first prayer was, I think, right before my first son was born, that I just wanted him to be healthy. He could be difficult, he could be a scoundrel, he could be whatever, the plan was for him. Just let him be healthy. It was one of those, God, I don't necessarily believe in you, but if I'm wrong and you're listening, here goes. But I like how I pray better now, because I have a different relationship with God going through those at-bats, going through doing my scales, so that now when I pray spontaneously, I can immediately fall into a place of connection, or if not immediately, then faster, let's say that. And this has been one of the most beneficial and valuable things in my life, is the prayer practice that I have, not from going spontaneous all the time, but from practicing with the community in prayer services. So with that, that's a lot of philosophy and theology to share with you. My goal today was to give you, let's say, these two major modes of Jewish prayer, keva and kavanah, the fixed and the spontaneous, to say that both are native to Judaism, both belong, both have value, both have challenges, but if you live in the tension between them, you can have a really impactful prayer life. And I just speaking from personal experience here. So let's go into the chat, see who else has joined us, see what kind of questions people have. Mostly it's Count Connor coming in and talking baseball to people and fire-breathing squirrels. All right. So let's see. This is bad radio, but I'm reading the chats at this point. Okay. We got Drake coming in from Huntsville, Alabama. Good to see you here, Drake. And let's see. Val's coming in from Florida. William asks, do I have to pray in Hebrew or in my common language? That is an excellent question, William. I'm really glad you asked it. So we do have a tradition of praying in Hebrew, which gets us all sort of praying in our same sacred language. However, the rabbis of old and rabbis today, and this guy, Ratchier, will tell you, whatever prayer you have to say, pray it in the language that you understand, right? At base. That is the most basic, most fundamental thing you can do, is pray in a way that you understand what you are saying. Is there a value to learning the Hebrew prayers? Absolutely, right? This is where the keva goes into the kavanah. When you practice, how do I want to put this? I'll put this as a challenge. When you are learning how to pray and you're learning the mode of Jewish prayer, you should absolutely say the prayers in a language that you understand. And every once in a while, try to practice the Hebrew as well, whether it's by showing up regularly, decoding the Hebrew language yourself as you're learning Hebrew. Try the Hebrew prayers, try to learn them, and as you learn them more, the Hebrew will be among the languages that you understand. And this has all sorts of benefits to it. One is you learn Hebrew, right? You learn the language of our tradition. You learn the language that the Torah was written in. which gives you, I'll just speak for myself, gives me a greater connection to the sources, right? The prayers that were written, and this is another thing that Rabbi Dorff teaches, all of our prayers were written at some point by a single individual who was having a personal experience with God and then wrote that prayer to reflect that experience. Right? These prayers didn't come out of God's mouth at Sinai and God said, pray all these prayers every day forever. The Hebrew prayer book, the Siddur, evolved over time as different people wrote prayers based on their own personal connection with God. And look, that might not be exactly your personal that might not be exactly your personal experience with God. Like I said, I'm not a farmer. I don't pray for crops the same way a farmer prays for crops. But what I can understand, and I can understand even better when I understand the Hebrew, is I can understand the emotional state and true intention of the person who wrote that down. And even if I can't connect to the words, maybe I can connect to that intention, right? When I pray for somebody's healing, sometimes I'll use the Hebrew. If it's really desperate, I'll say what I have to say to God in English in my native tongue. But when I can say it in Hebrew with understanding, I am connecting my prayer to the ancient prayer tradition of the people, right? I'm connecting it to a body of thought and a body of belief and a body of practice that is far greater than myself. And for me, that feels like it's lifting up my prayer, just in a way that a team lifts us up in our performance more than, say, just individual performance. So there's a value to learning the Hebrew. I would encourage everybody out there to do it. While you are learning, feel free to pray your most important prayers in a language that you understand. There's an old story about a shepherd. This rabbi was walking through a field and he hears this shepherd boy, and the shepherd boy is, has his hands lifted up to heaven and he's saying, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, Hey. And he's essentially reciting the Hebrew alphabet with great fervor. And the rabbi says, boy, what are you doing? Don't you know the prayers to say? What are you just sitting out here saying the Aleph Bet? Are you practicing for a quiz or something? And the shepherd says to the rabbi, look, I don't know the prayers yet. I'm a shepherd boy. I've never been to school a day in my life, but over the years I have learned the Hebrew alphabet. And so I feel like, look, God knows what's in my heart. I'm going to give God all the letters, and God can put them in the right order for me, right? Wherever you are, it's bringing your intentionality to it, which counts the most. This was a teaching from the first chapter of Leviticus a couple of weeks ago, where they said, whether you bring a bull for an offering or a pigeon for an offering or a sack of flour for an offering, three things with very different market prices, let's say, these are adored by God in exactly the same measure if your heart has the same intentionality. And so wherever you are in your prayer life, get started. Learning Hebrew is valuable because it brings us closer to the tradition and also closer to the community. You can feel more connected to the community of people who may be praying. You may go to a synagogue, especially if you go to Jerusalem or something like that. You may be in a place, it's full of tourists for people from all over, different countries all over. When you learn the Hebrew, you can sit in a prayer service and pray alongside people whose native language is Spanish, Portuguese, German, Chinese, what have you. But once you learn the Hebrew, you can all still be connected in that space. Thank you, William, for bringing that great question, a primary question, but one that bears repeating. Vanessa asks, is there a prayer book for beginners? There are probably several. Every congregation, every different movement or denomination will have its own prayer books, often because different denominations make different choices about what prayers to say in the service. Some of those denominations will have prayer books especially designed for the Hebrew school kids. And I know this isn't a juvenile question because, adults are learning how to pray too. If you can find a prayer book for little kids that sort of simplifies our most important prayers and teaches them in a way that we can acquire them, start there. One of my heroes in the rabbinic world is Rebbi Akiva. And Rebbi Akiva, before he was Rebbi Akiva, he was just Akiva ben Yosef, right? He was a shepherd, and he was illiterate until the age of 40. At which point, he was sweet on this lady, and the lady whose father was a very well-to-do guy said, like, look, my father's not going to let me marry you unless you are either wealthy or a renowned scholar. And for somebody who's illiterate at the age of 40, those were probably thought to be unreachable on either way, whether you're going to be a famous scholar or a rich man. But he decided he was going to go the route of the scholar. And he didn't know a single letter of Hebrew. But it said what he did was he went to cheder. He went to like kindergarten. And if you can imagine this big outdoorsy guy, kind of a dirty shirt, scraggly beard, smells a little bit like sheep, sits in a kindergarten in one of those tiny chairs and learns Aleph and learns Bet, the first two letters. And then it said he learned Aleph to Taf, the whole alphabet. And from there he began to read Torah. And from there he went on to read Mishnah and really studied the entirety of the canon. And when he passed, some say he had 12,000 students, some say he had 24,000. And became one of the greatest scholars of our tradition. But my point is, he started by wedging himself into a tiny little kindergarten chair. So if you want to learn Jewish prayers, go on Google or there's a site called Berman House that has a lot of educational resources. Look for a child's siddur and learn that way. And don't be ashamed, right? It takes courage to learn. It takes swallowing a little bit of ego. Once you are getting more comfortable with the Hebrew, there's one I'll recommend that was recommended to me, and that is the Art Scroll Siddur. There's a publishing company called Art Scroll out there that has done a magnificent job over the last, let's say, 100 years or so, publishing different Jewish texts from the Tanakh to the Talmud to prayer books in a very accessible way, fully translated, but with the original Hebrew as well. And one of my early rabbis recommended the Art Scroll Siddur because it is the most complete, and it also has choreography in it. Right? It'll give you little symbols about like where to bow and where to bend your knees and things like that. And so that's a great place to learn from. Be aware that it is designed for people in the Orthodox movement of Judaism. So some of the translations and some of the intentionality and theology in there has that bias to it. I'm not knocking it, but that's never been my denomination I've been attracted to, but it was a great resource to learn from. And then from there, I just picked up the Siddur that was in the synagogues where I attended because I had learned from other sources. So there's great ways to go. If you want an adult Siddur, go for the Art Scroll. It's the most complete. Don't be surprised if some of the prayers that are said in there aren't said in your particular service, because it's so complete that there are even Orthodox services that don't say all of those prayers. It just decided to have everything in there. But also don't be shy about picking up something for little kids, because in your learning, I'm not speaking directly to you, Vanessa, but like anybody here, your learning may be at the level of, where little kids are. So start there. Start where you are with what you have, with what you can access, and you will grow. So let's see. We have see Sappora's in the house. CJ says, yes, I would recommend Ivdu et Hashem B'Simcha, Ivdu et Hashem B'Smicha by Rabbi Zaslow. It's a renewal Siddur, but it has beautiful meditations and is very accessible with transliteration. Transliteration can be very helpful. Transliteration is when you write the Hebrew phonetically in let's say Roman letters, which looks like English, and you can sound it out with an alphabet that you're familiar with, and you can learn the prayers that way while you're learning the Hebrew. And CJ says this Ivdu et Hashem is available on Amazon. So Rolando is joining us. Shalom Aleichem, everyone. Aleichem Shalom, Rolando. Thank you for joining us. Let's see. What other? Here's Count Connor on fire-breathing squirrels. William says, when does one, excuse me, let me take a little sip of fuel here. William asks, when does one specifically pause while reading the the language is escaping me. I've got Allegra and Dayquil fighting a heroic battle in my head right now. When does one specifically pause while reading the Siddur and improvise your own prayers? I'm going to say wherever you need to. In general, a good place is during the Amidah, because while the Amidah, that's the standing prayer sort of right in the apex of the service, while it's all scripted out there for you, it was originally designed, and I learned this from Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, who was a master teacher on lots of Jewish traditions, including a great book he wrote on Jewish meditation, where he goes into saying that meditative practices in Judaism isn't something we borrowed from Buddhists or somebody else. Meditation has always been native to Jewish practice, and the Amidah was one of the original Jewish meditations. So that is a place where you can insert your own prayers. If you want to pray the script of the Amidah, at the end it says pray your own prayer. It gives you one as an example, but it doesn't have to be that one. During weekday prayer services in the morning, if you go to a weekday prayer service, like a daily minyan someplace, there's often a prayer called Tachanun, where you'll see after people are done with their Amidah, they'll sit down and maybe put their head on their arm, or they'll lay down, and that's a particular place that we don't do that on Shabbat, we don't do it on holidays, but in weekday services, you'll see people kind of put their head down on their arm, sitting down, and that is the quintessential place for personal prayers. But I'll say you can pause anytime during the service and say your own prayers. You should probably say them to yourself, right? You should probably say them like sotto voce, so you're not distracting anybody else and interfering in their prayer life, but you can absolutely say them. So let's see who is in the chat. Carmen is saying good things about the Jew Curious School, and I really appreciate that. We're really happy to have you, and I look forward to learning more with you. Miriam asks, what's the difference between saying Lord Hashem, Adonai, Eternal God, then Master of the Universe, Sovereign, heard all different versions? So you will encounter in the prayer book many different names for God. Part of the Jewish tradition is that we don't really know what God's name is, because God's being transcends naming. Any sort of, Maimonides said that you can only define God in the negative, meaning that God is not limited, God is not corporeal, because any positive thing you say about God would necessarily be limiting to the nature of God. And yet, we like to talk to God, right? Yet we like to bless God and call on God and praise God. And so we need a name, we need a handle. And so we've come up with many different handles over the years. One of my favorite exercises when I teach the Miller Introduction to Judaism class, which I highly recommend for anybody who is in a city where the Miller program is taught. There's a number of them going on here in Southern California, teaching one in Pasadena tonight. One of my favorite lessons is in our chapter about God, where we have this worksheet, and on the worksheet there are something like 39 different names for God. None of them the right one, none of them the exclusively true one. There is a tradition that back when the temple stood, one day a year, the holiest day of the year, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would go into the Kadosh Kadoshim, the Holy of Holies, and pronounce the name of God, and this name was only known to the Kohen Gadol, and I guess maybe anybody he was training up to be next in line for that. And it was only said out loud by one person, one time a year, out of earshot of everybody. And since we have lost the temple, we have also lost that knowledge. And so forever we're reaching for different ways to talk about God at different times. And what I love about this exercise is these are 39 different names of God that come from all over the place in the Siddur, and also some from Kabbalah. And some of them, we talk about God as Hamakom, like the ever-present. Sometimes we talk about Adonai El Elyon, like the God who is most high. There's a place in the there's a place in the Song at the Sea, the Shirat Hayam, which is what we sang when we crossed the Split Sea after leaving Egypt, where we call God Adonai Ish Milchama. Right? We name God a man of war. And a lot of people kind of chafe at that. They're like, I don't like thinking about God as like a war god. That sounds very Martian. Right? It sounds very Greek. But in that moment where God went to bat for us and went to battle for us, we praised God in that sense, right? There are other places where we call God Adonai Tzvaot, like the Lord of Hosts. And that was like, what's host? Is that like, like a hostess cupcake? Is that a host of a party? But the word hosts meant like a division of an army, right? So again, we're talking about God as a general who leads armies of angels. And for some people, that sounds very harif and very warlike, but sometimes you need a God to fight for you. Right? And so in that moment, people related to God in that way. There are other times where we talk about the God of peace. There are other times where we call God Ayin, which means nothingness. And this is like the hardest thing for people to get their heads around. But this is a Kabbalistic notion of God where we call God the nothing, because God is something to the extent that we can't get our heads around it, right? Any material ascription to God would be limiting to God, so we call God the nothingness, the thing that pervades every other essence. So we have lots of different names for God. These prayers were written at different times by people who had different needs. When we say Hashem, we talk about God as the name, right? Because God has so many names, sometimes we just say the name, right? And some of these have to do with people have hesitation about writing out the name of God, and so they take an O out of the word God, or the O out of the word Lord, or sometimes they even take the vowels out of Hashem. This is because we're very careful about writing down the name of God, lest that piece of paper be destroyed. And so people have different traditions for that. The word Adonai just means my Lord, in a kind of a feudal sense. But this is how we pronounce often in prayer the tetragrammaton, the Yud He Vav He, where God's name appears in the Torah as Yud He Vav and He. However, part of our tradition is that we don't pronounce that word as it appears on the page. This is just letters that stand for God, but we don't pronounce it. Instead, we say Adonai. And this has led some translators, most of them, started out as, German, where the Yud sound is made by the letter J, and when they spell that out in German transliteration, it looks like Jehovah. Or if you're writing it in English transliteration, it looks like Yahweh. And so there are those who don't understand how we pronounce the name of God, who say, oh, the Jewish God's name is Jehovah or Yahweh. And, but I went into a synagogue and they never said Yahweh once. And it's because I just hate to tell you, that's not how we say the name of God. But that's some people's understanding. So there are lots of different names we have for God, none of them complete. But if we're going to talk to somebody or about somebody, we have to put a handle on it. And so we put the handle on it that strikes us as most appropriate in that moment. Let's see. CJ asks, where can one find a list of prayers that must be said for Shacharit when davening alone at home? I use a millennial Siddur, but would rather switch to my copy of the Sim Shalom like we use at the synagogue. And so I think a really good resource for this is a book. Sometimes it's hard to find, sometimes not. It's called To Pray as a Jew by Rabbi Donin, Donin. And so that is a great, is another, Orthodox guy, but it works for conservatives, works for Reform as well, but gives a great rundown of all the different prayers in the service. And it's been a while since I've read it, but I'm going to guess that he breaks down, okay, here are the things that you need to say, that you need a minyan to say, you need to say in a community. Everything else you can say by yourself at home. Count Connor asks, curious about melodies and how there's variation of melodies dependent on where you daven. Is there a view on how melody plays into the prayers themselves? And this is a great question. Which is a great way to stall while I think of an answer. Somebody called me on this once, and he asked me a question, And I said, "That's a good question, Barney." And he said, "I know, I only ask good questions." And so from then I couldn't stall on Barney anymore. Alav Shalom, a good friend of mine. May his memory be for a blessing. So how to answer this question about melodies. So the melodies have come in, I'm going to say, to help us pray. We have a tradition of putting our prayers to music since the time before the first temple, since David. When David wrote the Psalms, they were intended as songs. David was famous for being a musician. He played the lyre and probably some other instruments as well. He was a very versatile guy, in addition to being a general and, super handsome and a great poet. But since the time the temple stood, there was a tradition that there would be a choir of Levites singing these things. So music has always been a part of our prayer service. It helps you remember prayers when there's a song. It helps you remember prayers when there's a song to it. For example, it gets everybody on the same page, I'll say, spiritually and emotionally. One of my great lessons in prayer was when a rabbi said to me, that moment when everybody's singing a song that they know, then they all feel oddly connected in some way, like Happy Birthday or Take Me Out to the Ball Field. And I said, yeah. And he's like, your services should be like that. You need 2 moments like that. And if you teach a little Torah in between, that's a service. So music has always facilitated not only spiritual uplift of the individual, but connection of the prayer community. And over time, those have evolved based on the communities where people were. And so, for example, many of the songs we sing in Reform or conservative or maybe Orthodox services today sound a little bit like polkas. They sound a little bit like German drinking songs. If you're familiar with German like beer hall drinking songs, and there's a good reason for this, is that people wanted, the people in the community wanted people to pray, so they put them to a tune that was familiar, but made the words a little bit more holy, let's say. But so if some prayers in the service sound like a German drinking song or a polka, that's because this part of the service, this tradition developed at a time when these songs were popular. And different places you go try on different tunes. There's a place that I go, there's a place that I serve where the cantor is from Argentina. And so her musical tradition adds to the canon of these sort of Latin American sounding, brings in a lot of Ladino, which is sort of the Sephardic Yiddish, if you will, the Ladino tunes. And so it has to do with where Jews have been throughout history and have picked up new tunes, have added them to the service. One colleague of mine said in her liturgy class, the professor said the Jewish liturgy or the Jewish prayer service is like a room with an entrance and no exit, meaning that we adopt new traditions, but we are very slow to let old traditions go. And so every place will be, in the moment, a product of the traditions that it has accumulated. And sometimes this makes a little gap between 2 different synagogues. I mean, what I like is any synagogue you go to on a given Shabbat, you will be reading the same Torah reading as just about every other synagogue in the world. However, the music and the prayer tunes in between will be very much a product of that place and its own particular tradition. And so I'll challenge you to go to different prayer spaces, try on different tunes, and if you want to learn them, you will learn them exactly the way that you learned the tunes that you're familiar with, and that is repetition. But if I can once more go back and make the case for Keva, there's something powerful about learning how to pray the way the community prays. Because not only do you become connected to God at that point, but you become connected to the other people in the room, right? You become part of this community the more you pray and sound like that community. This isn't an abnegation or obliteration of self. This is a connection of your own prayer to the prayers of those people. And so when you're bowing when they bow, stand when they stand, sit when they sit, everybody there is praying as an individual, but when you're flying in formation, it's amazing how that can elevate the feeling of your own prayer. Let's see. Miriam, I think it's a... Let's see, I'm looking for questions here. We'll share a comment. CJ says, I really like Mayim Bialik's description of God. I can easily feel the awe of God when I think about the vastness of the universe and how miraculous it is that we are a spinning rock in space. So I'll cotton to that as well. I have different images of God in my head. I know we're not supposed to make images, but I can think whatever I want to think. And I have different encounters with God at different points in my life. And I think I think Dr. Bialik's description is apt. Victoria shares, sometimes I read prayers when my heart is troubled and my head... Victoria shares, sometimes I read prayers when my heart is troubled and my head can't find the words to say. That, Victoria, and everybody here, is what they are there for. Sometimes we can't express our emotion, our feeling, our need in words, and so the tradition gives us a vast repertoire that we can find our own hearts in sometimes in ways that we don't expect. So with that, we've been going for about an hour now, so I'm about to wrap up this podcast recording. I really appreciate everybody who has weighed in today. Saw some new faces in the crowd, saw some people I know in person who have showed up here for the first time. So really excited to have done this learning with you. So just as a practical thing, I'm going to do my radio announcery voice that concludes the podcast. That two birds, we're having a video here, but we're also recording something for other people, and it sounds a little something like this. To all we're going to wrap up this episode right now, but first I want to say a tremendous word of gratitude to all the heroes who have joined us in the live studio audience to say We're going to wrap up this episode now, but first I want to give some tremendous gratitude to all the heroes who have showed up in our live studio audience today. Your questions, your thoughts, your communicating with each other in the background always makes me feel good about the community that we built. But your questions, I believe, will really help people who are listening to this show right now. Talking of which, hero, I am overjoyed and overwhelmed with gratitude that you have learned about this topic with us today. Thank you for listening to the Jew Curious School. Thank you for listening to the Jew Curious Show. If you would like to participate in a future live studio recording, all you have to do is find me on the YouTube. Go to youtube.com, look for Rabbi John Carrier. That's John with an H, Carrier, just like that giant boat that holds airplanes. And when you find me in my channel page, you'll see all the upcoming live sessions that we have scheduled. Hop into it, get into the chat, hop into one of those, get into the chat, ask the questions that you have so that you can help Jew curious people just like you. If you'd like further, if you'd like to go deeper into this community that we're building together, check out the Jew Curious Community Center. This is a lovingly tended, carefully guarded, troll-free private Facebook group that you can access by going to jewcurious.show/JCC, as in Jew Curious Community Center. Go there and you will find a way to download instructions on exactly how to join this group. I've been overjoyed to see how people connect with each other, how people support each other, share their stories, share their concerns, share their joys, and most of all, share a wonderful community with each other. One last favor to ask: if you have enjoyed learning with us today, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes. Go to iTunes, look for the Jew Curious Show, give us the appropriate number of stars, and share a note with us on how you felt about the learning today, what you get out of listening to this podcast, and that may help other people decide to give us a shot as well. If you're willing to do that, hero, I would be, as we say in Texas, much obliged. And until next time, hero, peace. All right. Thank you. Sorry, that little cough because Eric made me giggle. Count Connor shares, we could be heroes just for one day. That might be my new music. I don't know what the royalty would be on that. But in any case, really grateful to everybody who showed up today. I'll hang out for a couple more minutes if anybody has more questions. But otherwise, I'll just sign off. It's always my pleasure to learn with you. Tomorrow at 9 a.m. on Friday, we'll have our Friday Parshat HaShavua class. We are in Parashat Tazria right now, one of those exciting Torah readings that is mostly focused on disgusting skin conditions. So if you're curious about what the Torah says, or if you're curious about what the Torah means when it talks about leprosy, which is kind of a misnomer, it's not Hansen's disease, it's not a communicable neurological disorder. It is a kind of it is a kind of physical manifestation of a spiritual illness. And we'll talk about where that spiritual illness may come from. What's the particular sin that causes someone to break out in scaly skin? I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but it did. We're going to be talking about that tomorrow, right here on YouTube Live, 9 a.m. Pacific Time, noon Eastern. And God willing, we'll get that out as a podcast before the new week. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, for learning with me, for hanging out and being really nice to each other in the chat. That's what I enjoy the most about that, is people talking about baseball, talking about Delaware, sharing resources, and just being good human beings. That's what I'm most proud of about this community. So until next time, heroes, peace.